Have you ever heard of the sallow man? That's what Timmy Morrison asked me in 7th grade. Timmy was my best friend. We did nearly everything together. It was Friday, and we were sitting in lunch period discussing what we were going to do when he came over to stay the night after school. No, what the hell is that? I asked him, rolling my eyes because I figured this was going to be another one of Timmy's stories that his sister told him. Timmy's face put on that he'd always put on when he was talking about something that someone hadn't heard of before. My sister told me about him. She said he comes to you if you say some words in front of a mirror. I don't remember it all, but I wrote down what she told me. I figured we could try it out at your house. I rolled my eyes to make it seem like I thought it was childish, but in truth I was interested. Creepy stuff like that always interested me, even though I knew it wasn't real. I just liked hearing the stories. I didn't want Timmy to know that I wanted to hear about it though, because then he'd just have something to be smug about. Is this just more of that Bloody Mary crap where she just comes out of the mirror to kill you? I asked him, pretending to pay attention more to my mashed potatoes than the conversation. No. The sallow man comes out of the mirror after you recite his poem, then he kills anyone you ask him to. That's what my sister said anyway, Timmy said as he turned to eat at his own tray. There was a poem involved? I thought. Now, I really did have to know more. What do you mean, what poem? I asked him. Timmy lazily reached into one of his many folders that he carried around for school and pulled out a piece of paper that was a bit crinkled. He slid it over to me on the cafeteria table, and I examined it without picking it up. This is what it read. In dark halls within the after. From those halls you hear my laughter. Dark thoughts intrigue your mind. To for now break down my bind. I will take what ails you in this land. And I will leave no trace, for I am sallow man. I nearly laughed as I read the last lines. I was up for anything spooky, sure, but this was really corny. Timmy, you don't really believe this crap, do you? Your sister was probably just messing with you. Timmy didn't say anything at first. He just concentrated on his tray for a moment, then he said, Brandon, do you remember last year when my parents were fighting a lot? My dad was drinking all the time and I stayed over at your house nearly every night for a while. Of course I remembered that. Timmy was over at my house every night. My parents allowed it because they knew what was going on. It was a small town, everyone did. Yeah, Tim, I remember. I said, the mood now solemn. My dad hit my mom a lot, and whenever me or my sister was home he would call me a bastard and he would call my sister a whore. It was a nightmare. I could sense Timmy's gaze turn towards me, so I looked up from my tray as well. He stared at me for a moment, waiting for me to say something, so I did. I thought your dad stopped drinking though, and everything was okay? I asked, trying to lighten the mood a bit. Timmy responded then, with anger starting to edge into his voice. Yeah, he stopped drinking, but nothing got better. Sure, he stopped hitting Mom, but she barely speaks to him or anyone else in the house anymore. I know it's because of him. I know she's still afraid of him. I was a bit shocked. Timmy had never mentioned anything about that before. I just figured once Timmy started staying at his house again everything was fine. So what, are you going to sick the sallow man on your dad? Timmy, that's nuts. It's just some story that your sister probably heard from one of the other seniors. I told him. But what if there's a chance it would work? I need to try, Brandon, but I want you to be with me. Timmy looked dead serious. I don't know, Tim, it just seems silly, I told him. Please, Brandon, I need you there, please. Timmy gave me a look of pure desperation, and I felt sorry for him. I decided that I'd be there to support him. He lived in a broken home, and he was grasping at straws. I knew it couldn't be good for him, but he was my best friend. What choice did I have? Okay, Tim, I got your back. Let's summon a ghost. The next thing I knew, it was after school, and Timmy and I had locked ourselves in my small downstairs bathroom at home. Do the lights need to be off or anything? I asked. No, at least I don't think so. I think all I have to do is recite the poem in front of the mirror, and then he appears. Timmy pulled out the piece of paper with the poem on it that he had in his back pocket, then cleared his throat. I stood back and leaned against the wall with my arms crossed. Usually when people did this sort of thing it was in the dark, maybe with a lit candle or two. But the lights were on, and the floral wallpaper that was all around my bathroom didn't exactly inspire fear, so I felt pretty stupid in that bathroom with Timmy. I was just thankful Mom and Dad were still at work so they didn't catch us and wonder what was wrong with their son. Timmy finally began to speak after what seemed like minutes. In dark halls within the after. From those halls you hear my laughter. Dark thoughts entreat your mind. To for now break down my bind. I will take what ails you in this land. And I will leave no trace, for I am Sallow Man. Timmy spoke loudly and clearly. When he finished, he held his breath, waiting for something to happen. At that point I was absolutely convinced Timmy was wasting his time. I sighed and closed my eyes waiting for him to realize the same thing. I heard him gasp, which I took to be a sound of defeat. I opened my eyes and was about to console Timmy, but then I saw the real reason he had made a sound. When I opened up my eyes, I saw the mirror no longer showed our reflections, but a long dark hallway. The hallway's floor, walls, and even its ceiling seemed to be moving, undulating back and forth like the insides of some giant worm. The hallway was poorly lit by some unseen source, and at the very end of it I could see the shape of what looked like a man moving toward the mirror. For a moment, I was stuck in disbelief. I couldn't move, I could only watch as the figure in the mirror came closer and slowly, its features became clearer and clearer. It was a man, or what seemed to be a man, bald and completely naked. His skin was a pale, sickly yellow. He was skinny, so emaciated that his jaundiced skin was taut against his skeleton, and every one of his ribs were visible. With thin and lanky legs, he walked ever closer to the mirror with a shambling gait. His long, ghoulish arms dragged his knuckles along the hall as he walked, parting the undulating floor for a fleeting moment before the floor came back together. When I noticed this I squinted my eyes to try and sharpen my vision in an attempt to see what it was that was making the floor and walls quiver like they were. The cause of the moving floor became clear as they started to move from within the mirror, and out into the bathroom. Cockroaches. The insects began to spill out of the mirror and onto the sink and floor below. That was enough for me, Timmy and I had to get out of that bathroom. I reached out for Timmy's arm and tried to pull him away, but he would not budge. He stood transfixed, his eyes glued to the mirror and the nightmare that was approaching. I tried a few more times to pull him away, shouting at him to snap out of it, but he wouldn't move. It was as if something unnatural was holding him in place, and wouldn't let him go. I gave up, and I turned tail, hauling ass for the door. As soon as I reached the door handle, thousands of cockroaches moving impossibly fast covered the handle and immediately after the door, leaving the door obscured completely by writhing and hissing insects. I yelled, cursing and screaming as I turned around to go for the window on the other side of the bathroom. I was silenced when I was met with the sight of a room, no longer recognizable as my bathroom, but was now more reminiscent of that hallway in the mirror. The walls and ceiling was covered in insects. When I looked down, I saw that the roaches covered the floor below, making only 2 small spaces where my feet stood. I dared not move then. I didn't know what would happen if I were to step on one of those bugs. I had the awful thought that if I were to move at all, the insects would strip my bones completely of flesh. I lifted my head slowly to the now dimly lit room. Flashes of light would strobe here and there as the roaches crawled along the light shade on the ceiling. I could now that 2 yellow and gnarled hands had appeared on either side of the mirror, and I knew the Sallow Man had come. Timmy stood there, his eyes still wide, his stature still unmoved. I distinctly remember a smell then, a sickly smell that called to mind dirty bedpans, and I had to cover my mouth and nose not to gag. Still, this didn't seem to bother Timmy whatsoever. When the awful smell came, so did the Sallow Man's head emerge from the mirror. His bald head was faced downward, and his neck stretched far into the room until his head was inches in front of Timmy's face. A voice came then, a hissing voice that seemed to come from the insects, and echo all around the room. "Who is the one to be taken to the after?" The voice said. Timmy moved then, for the first time since he recited the poem, by smiling a wide and unnerving grin. "My father," Timmy said, loud and clear, as if delivering the death sentence himself. In retrospect, I suppose he was. There was a murmuring sound then, as all of the insects began to vibrate loudly. Then after a moment, the insects parted and swarmed around the wall to the left of the mirror, and a man, who I recognized to be Timmy's father, rose from within the wall of swarming bugs. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. The insects were swarming him, presumably pinning him to the wall. I'm sure he would be screaming if the cockroaches weren't covering his mouth. "This is the one to be brought into the after?" That awful hissing echo came again, entreating an answer from Timmy, and without breaking his grin, Timmy said, "Yes." As if heeding the call of Timmy's word, the insects then began swarming into Timmy's father's mouth. His eyes showed his desperate fear as thousands of cockroaches began eating him from the inside out. I would say it was gruesome, but the insects were quick with their work. They devoured every bit of Timmy's father within seconds, leaving nothing left. Had my eyes not been glued to what was happening, I might have blinked, and I would have missed it. I looked back to Timmy, who had a satisfied and almost relieved looks on his face. But his look soon became one of terror as the sallow man spoke once more. "Now, you will join me in the after, boy. Such is the price to be paid." Timmy didn't move at all, save for the horrified shock that crawled over his face. I don't know if it was terror that kept him in place, or if it was the sallow man. But Jesus Christ, I wish I didn't see what happened next. The sallow man lifted his head slowly, revealing a face that had no features. No eyes, no nose, and no discernible marks whatsoever as far as I could tell. The only thing there was a mouth. The sallow man's lips, like the rest of him, were stretched tight, making his human-like and yellow teeth seem bigger than they were. Stunned into helplessness by my own fear, I could do nothing but watch as the sallow man's jaw unhinged and stretched to an impossible size. He then reached for Timmy and grabbed him, picking him up just as easy as if he weighed nothing at all. The sallow man then shoved Timmy into his mouth hole. Just like that, gone. Impossibly, my best friend was thrown into that awful ghoul's throat. I didn't even hear Timmy scream as the thing swallowed him. Tears were falling from my eyes freely as the sallow man closed his maw and turned his attention toward me as the insects began to retreat into the mirror behind him. Just before the sallow man disappeared behind the mirror, he smiled at me. I could feel his eyes that he did not have, burn into me. A buzzing sound filled my ears then, and I began to faint. Just before I hit the ground, I saw the sallow man duck his head back into the mirror and disappear. My mother arrived home from work at around 4 o'clock, and she found me on the bathroom floor passed out with the door closed. When Mom woke me up, my head was hazy, and it took me a moment to recall what had happened, and it was hard to think with Mom asking over and over if I was okay. But when I remembered, I became frantic, telling her something had happened to Timmy, and he disappeared, but I left out the part about the sallow man. My mother looked at me like I was crazy. "Who's Timmy, dear?" she asked with a raised eyebrow. "Mom, you know Timmy, he's my best friend," I yelled. "Oh, you made a new friend. What do you mean he disappeared?" I started to tell her that Timmy had been my best friend all my life. I was going to tell her that he had stayed over almost all of last year. But a sinking feeling in my stomach stopped me, and I pushed past my mother to the house phone. I was going to make a call to confirm my suspicion, but I hoped on hope I was wrong. I dialed Timmy's number, and his mother answered. "Hello?" I took in a deep breath and asked. "Hello, is Timmy there?" I asked. "I don't know any Timmy. Maybe you have the wrong number, sweetie?" Timmy's mother sounded much happier than I ever had heard her before. It wasn't enough to stop the tears from forming in my eyes, but it did prompt the next question I asked. "Are you married?" I asked, knowing how silly it sounded, but I had to know. "No, but I don't see how that's any of your business. Does your mother know you're using the phone?" I didn't reply, I just hung up. I turned and went up into my room. I dodged all my mom's questions and I went straight to bed. As I lie there, I thought hard about everything that had happened. I wondered if Timmy would want things this way. It was clear from the look of terror on his face that he had no idea he would have to pay such a heavy cost. I wondered if Timmy's sister knew about that part of the deal, if she left it out on purpose, or if she just didn't think it mattered, because after all it was just a stupid poem. But the biggest question that I kept asking myself, was Timmy still alive? I saw that thing swallow him whole, but was it possible in whatever world he was in, that he was still there with the sallow man? I hoped not, but hopes or not, I got my answer when Monday morning came. In class, all I could do was stare at Timmy's empty seat, and it was making me sick thinking about it. I asked my teacher if I could use the restroom, and was excused. I went straight to the sink once I made my way to the bathroom and turned on the tap. I turned the hot water on all the way and began to splash water into my face. When I was done, dried myself with paper towel, and my eyes met the now fogged up bathroom mirror. There, in the condensation, were 3 words. Help me, Brandon. Last winter, I was walking through a park near my apartment. I came across 5 young boys attempting to smash an object with a hammer. Granted, Chicago children are probably more violent than most, but I am not used to seeing such things in my particular neighborhood. I jogged over to them, mostly out of curiosity, but also to make sure they weren't torturing some poor squirrel or pigeon. If I had known the sort of thing I was about to come in contact with, I would have probably gone home and bolted the door. One of the boys was clutching some sort of dark wooden board covered with black paint. He was holding it at arm's length with his face turned away and his eyes closed. A second boy was aggressively prying the hammer out of the hands of the boy who had been swinging at the wooden board moments earlier. The other 2 kids were watching without saying a word. In spite of all the hammering and arguing, the surface of the board looked perfectly smooth and intact from the angle I was approaching. I put on my toughest adult voice and got the kids to quit yelling and fighting over the hammer. I asked them what in the hell they were trying to do. The boy holding the hammer looked me straight in the face and said, "We're gonna break the devil into 6 pieces and bury him in the woods." I was stunned but also amused. I figured he had seen something like this on television and sort of laughed it off. I asked, "So, you kids think this plank is the devil?" Peter or Paul was clearly not pleased by this question. He said something along the lines of, "Are you stupid or what? That thing ain't a plank." As I took my first look at the wooden board up close, I was surprised. The entire surface had not been painted with black paint as I had at first thought. It was actually hand-painted to the point that it was nearly covered with a language I wasn't familiar with. It looked vaguely Asian or Middle Eastern. It was entirely alien to me, aside from the upper left and right corners, which displayed very detailed paintings of the sun and moon. In the center of both the sun and moon were unnerving faces with blank expressions. As I thought about this last detail, it became clear to me that this board was some sort of antique handmade Ouija. Peter or Paul explained to me that his grandfather owned an antique store and was on his deathbed. He had requested that the boy's mother take this board from his store safe and break it into 6 pieces and dispose of it immediately, burying each piece in the woods not less than a mile apart from each other, he said. He would not say why this had to be done, but continuously referred to the board as that wooden devil. When the boy's mother refused, thinking it ludicrous, the grandfather had enlisted the boy and his friends, given them the store key, and told them the safe combination. "I remember the kid telling me he was disappointed," I said. He had always thought the safe held his grandfather's stash of ancient pirate treasure. Upon grabbing the wooden board from the safe, the boys had run into 2 problems. Firstly, the board was hard as stone and the best way to break it was turning into a point of argument. Secondly, the woods in Chicago were scarce, and woods large enough for burying things miles apart from each other were even scarcer. I decided to break the board myself to make sure the kids didn't get hurt. This proved to be extremely difficult, I remembered. I remember thinking that the board had to be reinforced with a steel plate or something. I was beating on the board with the hammer for the 100th time when I remembered I had a hacksaw. I told the kids to sit tight and jogged down the block to my apartment, I said. By the time I got back, it was snowing and the boys were playing in the snow. It was an unusually mild winter for us last year, and I think this may have been the beginning of the only snowstorm we had all year if I remember correctly, I added. The 5 of them continued to play with the snow as I hacked into the board with my saw. It took an unusually long time, but it worked. When the first piece snapped off, I picked it up and saw that the grain where it had been cut was unlike anything I had ever seen before, spiraling in a very distinct pattern that I can still picture in my head. The unstained wood was a deep reddish brown. When the board was in 6 pieces, Peter or Paul grabbed the corner with the picture of the sun. Then, he and one of his friends ran a short distance into a wooded area on the edge of the park and buried it about a foot down. As this was going on, the other boys explained to me that they were planning on spending the day riding the elevated train and taking the pieces to the various wooded areas they had come up with. They just needed one more place to bury the 6th piece and hadn't come up with anything yet. As it happened to be a Sunday, I offered to do it on the way to work the next day, and they agreed that it was a good plan. As the 5 of them walked away toward the north, I saw them enter a station for the Blue Line train, and I never saw them again. Later that night, as the snowstorm started to get really bad, I remember thinking that I hoped I hadn't made a mistake by letting them go off on their own. However, a strange adult hanging around with 5 neighborhood kids tends to give people the wrong idea, regardless of whether he's looking out for their safety. I hoped they had gotten their task finished before the storm had really hit. The corner of the board I had wound up with was the corner with the painting of the moon with the blank expression. I had really planned to bury it, I swear I did, but we all wound up snowed in the following morning and it ended up in the drawer of an end table. If you've ever been snowed in during a Chicago winter, you know that when this happens, they tend to send out these huge monolithic snow plows that push all of the snow into mountains on top of all the parked cars, none of which will be capable of moving an inch for at least 2 days. The day was rather uneventful, but as nightfall approached, I was taken by the eerie notion that someone was watching me through my living room window. I kept glancing toward it, expecting to see someone peering in at me, despite the fact that I live on the 3rd floor and my living room window faces the street. After a while, I shook off the notion, and I believe I went to sleep around 11. Around 1 a.m., I was awoken by what sounded like a mechanical device humming loudly. I assumed it to be my heater, possibly being overworked due to the snowstorm. I stood up and put my ear next to the vent, but the sound wasn't coming from there. I walked into the living room to check the settings on my thermostat, and immediately every hair on my body stood at full attention. The sound was coming from the direction of my living room window, and as I turned to look, I caught the ghastly image of a solid white face with a wide mouth and dark eye sockets on the other side of the glass. I quickly turned on a light, and the face disappeared. The mechanical droning noise seemed to recede. Had it all been my imagination, I wondered? When I was younger, I once had an episode of sleep paralysis where I witnessed a tree devouring my neighbor's dog through a bedroom window. But when I came out of it, the tree was back to normal, and the dog was perfectly fine. Had this been something similar? Nevertheless, I hardly slept the rest of the night. I kept thinking I was hearing that deep mechanical drone somewhere in the distance. By the next night, I had regained my wits and fell asleep in my bed sometime around midnight. I awoke once again, terrified, to the sound of the same mechanical drone as the previous night, but this time, much louder. As I sat up in bed, I saw the ghastly white face with sunken eyes on the other side of the window near the foot of my bed, no more than 3 feet from where I lay sleeping. It had no neck, arms, torso, nothing. It seemed to just float there above the streetlights below, emanating that horrible humming sound. I instinctively grabbed the drapes and pulled them closed, but the sound continued. Remembering what had happened the night before, I ran to the lights and flipped the switch. The noise slowly faded, but I was too afraid to open the drapes for the rest of the night. The next morning, I was still unable to get to work due to my car being frozen beneath a 7-foot pile of ice, but I absolutely had to get out of that apartment. I thought that if the face was going to come back, I would have to be ready for it somehow. I went to a sporting goods store in the neighborhood and purchased a box of ammo for the .22 range pistol I hadn't used in years. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I also bought some caffeine tablets and a bag of coffee. Before nightfall, I set up camp in my living room with the pistol and a coffee pot, took one of the caffeine tablets, and rigged up a portable audio recorder that I sometimes use for work. I don't own a camera, and my cell phone's video function had not been working for months, so the best I could do was attempt to snap some photos in the dark with the cell if the face appeared again. It showed itself around 3 in the morning. I was beginning to crash from all of the caffeine when I began to hear the droning sound approaching from the distance. I readied my gun in one hand and my cell phone in the other, but the face didn't appear at the window. I began to wonder if perhaps the face was outside my bedroom window, and as I snuck through the dark toward the door, the sound seemed to get louder. However, as I entered the room, the door slammed and locked behind me, and I heard glass shattering in the living room. Suddenly, the apartment was filled with the noises of things being smashed, thrown, and torn to pieces. The droning noise was deafeningly loud, and I covered one ear and turned my head away as I clawed at the doorknob with my other hand, but it simply would not open. It was as if the lock had been welded shut. After about 30 seconds of this, I raised my foot and smashed the door open with 2 kicks. Immediately, the crashing in the living room stopped, but the room itself had been completely torn to pieces. And as I looked up above the debris at the shattered window, I saw the face one last time, staring at me from the other side of my demolished Venetian blinds. It opened its mouth, exposing a wide dark cavern, the likes of which I hoped to never see again, and the horrible sound got louder and louder as I snapped a single photograph with my camera and the flash went off. Then, in an instant, the face was gone. All I have to prove my story is a single blurry photograph and the audio taken by my portable recorder in those last few minutes. But the thing that disturbed me the most is the corner of the wooden board with the painting of the moon was sitting atop the debris in the exact center of the room, and the face had been altered so that the expression was identical to what I had just seen in the window pane, with the wide, gaping, cavernous mouth. I buried it in the woods the following morning. You know that horror movie trope about mirrors? The one where the protagonist is near a mirror and they look or shift away from the mirror for just a moment, and when they look back, a ghost, killer, or some other entity appears, and then usually rapidly disappears when they turn around. I've always disliked looking into mirrors, and for a while, I convinced myself that it was caused by an overactive imagination combined with seeing the situation one too many times in a movie. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that it's much more than that. I don't dislike looking into mirrors, I'm afraid of it. Something has always just felt off about it. I recognize the image in my reflection as me, but it has never felt familiar. I brought it up to a friend once, and she goggled at me for a moment, and then laughed, though I could hear a tinge of fear behind it. What do you mean, you don't recognize your reflection? How is that even possible? It's the same reflection that you've been staring at your whole life. And she was right, of course. But that was part of the problem. My reflection has never felt normal to me. Not in the way that it should. Not in the way that it does to other people. I've observed the reflections of friends and family members when they're standing near mirrors. It doesn't feel the same. It feels connected to them. A simple mirror image. Even when their eyes meet mine in the mirror, I don't feel the oppressive feeling of other that I get when I meet my own eyes in my reflection. With no explanation that seemed to fit my experiences, I chalked it up to it just being a weird quirk and decided to just get on with my life. When I moved into my first apartment by myself, I removed all of the mirrors, except for one that I kept in my guest room. It stayed covered with a sheet unless I absolutely needed to use it. You'd be surprised how well you can get by without mirrors when you've been doing it your whole life. I even got pretty good at applying makeup without seeing what I was doing. Every once in a while, I'd catch my reflection in a mirror in a public bathroom or if I looked wrong into my rearview mirror, and it would set my heart racing. I always felt menaced when it happened, and it would take me a few moments to calm down again. But all in all, I was doing fairly well with my mirror avoidance strategies. However, that all changed one day at work. I work in the artifact restoration department at my city's history museum. It's typically fascinating, delicate, and detailed work, and I love it. I mostly work with pottery or statues and carvings, but I always knew that one day someone would bring me an antique mirror to restore and I would have no choice but to do it. I had been at the museum for 5 years and it still hadn't happened. I had almost convinced myself that I was in the clear. Alas, that was not the case. It was late on a Friday when it was first brought to me. The museum director had it wheeled in under a sheet, but I immediately knew what it was. I could tell from the dread that practically exploded inside me. He beamed at me as he whipped the sheet off. "Isn't it magnificent?" he crowed. "Early 1700s. French." He smiled at me, waiting for my exclamations over its beauty, I'm sure. My breath felt like it was caught in my throat as I stared down my full reflection for the first time in what had been years. It looked back at me, also with a petrified expression, but it felt different. Like my reflection's face was an act. A mimicking of my face, not an exact copy. I stood transfixed for a minute, trapped under my own gaze. Suddenly the director stepped into my line of view, blocking the mirror from my sight. "Well, what do you think? Gorgeous, isn't it? Doesn't look like it needs too much work." A little spit shine, maybe, he said with a grin, winking at me. Yes, gorgeous, I mumbled. He must have noticed how white I had gone, because he recovered the mirror and put his hand on my shoulder. Don't stress about it. I know you'll do a great job. And don't worry about starting today. You can get cracking on Monday. With that, he turned and left the room, leaving me alone with the mirror. I put my head in my hands and rubbed my temples with my thumbs. Okay, you can do this, I whispered to myself. You have the whole weekend to prepare. I looked up at the clock. 5:15, I grabbed my things and headed for the door. I'd deal with the mirror on Monday. I had almost made it all the way out of the building when I realized I had left my keys on my work table. Shit, I moaned. But there was nothing to be done for it. I needed the keys to lock up the building. Before I opened the door back to my workspace, I took a deep breath. It's just a stupid mirror, I said to myself. I stepped into the room. Everything looked normal. I stepped quickly past the mirror to my desk. I bent to open the drawer where I kept my keys, and when I turned around, the sheet that had been covering the mirror moments before was in a pile on the floor in front of it. My knees went weak and I had to grab onto my desk to keep them from buckling. It just fell, that's all, I whispered out loud. When I walked by it quickly, it made a breeze that knocked it off. I felt deep down that that was not what had happened at all, but saying it out loud gave me enough courage to approach the mirror to replace the sheet. Once I was in front of it, I knelt down to grab the sheet, never once taking my eyes off of my reflection. As I straightened back up, I turned to face the mirror head-on. With one hand, I reached out and lightly pressed my fingertips against my reflections. My fingers stopped at the cold, hard glass. It was cold enough that the warmth from my fingers fogged up a little area around each tip. My reflection had the tiniest of smiles playing around her lips. I didn't feel myself smiling, but it was such a small one perhaps I didn't notice myself doing it. I rearranged my face into grotesque poses just to make sure my reflection did it, too. She did, but it brought me little comfort. I took a step forward until my face was practically touching the mirror. I could see every pore, every freckle. It looked familiar, but it felt alien. I breathed onto it, fogging the surface in front of my face. I slowly traced a heart into the fog. I saw my reflection do the same, but then I noticed something odd. I couldn't see the heart I drew in the reflection. My heart began to thump wildly in my chest. I hastily used my sleeve to wipe away the remnants of my breath. The fog in the reflection, however, remained. I sucked in a sharp breath of air and took a staggering step back. I pressed my palms into my eyelids until I saw stars. I slowly counted to 10 and opened my eyes. All I could see was my reflection staring worriedly back at me. She looked pale and faint, exactly how I felt. But it still didn't look or feel quite right. I threw the sheet back over the mirror and ran out of the building. By the time I arrived home, I had calmed down significantly. Enough that I was suddenly able to remember that I had a date that night. I groaned out loud. I didn't really want to go, but I actually did like this guy. We had already been on a few dates and had hit it off well. So I pulled myself together the best I could. By the time Nick arrived to pick me up, I had shaken off the vestiges of my earlier terror. While at dinner, he asked me how my day had been. I hesitated, not wanting to tell him about what had happened, or about my irrational and odd reactions to mirrors. But I suddenly realized that I had a desperate desire to tell someone about what had happened, even if it made me sound crazy. I relayed the story to him, never once looking into his eyes. I didn't want to see what I knew would be reflected there. Fear, anxiety, disgust. But when I finished and did look up, he was simply studying me. After a moment, he reached out and took my hand. "You know what I read once?" he asked. I shook my head silently. It was on one of those microblog, social media sites. It said, "What if the only reason we can't walk through mirrors is because our reflection blocks us? What if they know that the other side is horrifying and painful and they are trying to keep us from ever crossing over?" He shrugged. "Just a weird thing I read. But it sounds like yours isn't trying to protect you, it's trying to get out of there," he said with a laugh. Wouldn't that be something? That would explain why you feel like you do. I sat in stunned silence. My throat was as dry as the desert. I had to forcefully swallow several times before I could speak again. Yeah, that would be something. My mind was racing with what he had said as we left the restaurant. His little theory perfectly described how I felt, but I didn't know what to do with that information. It was nonsense, after all. I wanted only to go home at that point, but Nick grabbed my hand. I actually have something in mind for us to do tonight. But it's a surprise. I sighed internally, but smiled at him. Sure. Lead the way. We caught a cab and got out in front of what looked like an old abandoned warehouse. I might have thought that's what it was, too, if it wasn't for the line of people out the door. What's this? I asked. It's an adventure space, he said with a huge smile. Kind of like a playhouse for grown-ups. I've seen it advertised all over the place. There's supposed to be things to explore and climb on. Stuff like that. I couldn't help but smile at his infectious excitement. Okay. Let's check it out, I said with a giggle. The first few rooms were indeed a lot of climbing and twisting and bending and crawling. We kept losing each other and then finding each other by the sound of our laughter. I was surprised at how much fun I was having. He grabbed my hand as we moved towards the last room. I think you'll like this one the best, he said, pulling me forward. I was about to ask why, but the word died on my lips as we walked through the doorway. It was a room full of mirrors. A much larger and more terrifying version of a funhouse made for children. He shoved me further into the room so that the door behind us slammed shut. To help you get over your fear, he said with another shove. Never before had I felt the level of fear that rose in my chest than at that moment. It was all-consuming. It wiped nearly every other thought from my mind. I was facing down hundreds of my own reflection, and they looked horrifying. I turned to Nick to beg him to help me out of there, but he had disappeared. Nick? I croaked, my voice cracking with terror. Nick! I screamed. I heard him laughing as he shouted, "This way." I stumbled forward, hands outstretched, unable to tell which way was correct. Tears began pouring out of my eyes as I struggled to breathe under the weight of my panic. Every direction I looked was a reflection of myself, each one looking more ominous than the last. I turned a corner and saw hundreds of reflections of the back of my head, all lined up in a row. I was paralyzed with fear. I closed my eyes and took a few shuddering, deep breaths. Nick? I called out again. This time, I got no answer. I knew to get out I was going to have to open my eyes. There was no way I was making it out of there blind. I opened my eyes and was greeted with the same sight I had seen when I had closed them. I exhaled loudly, a tiny wave of relief hit me. I heard a noise to my right and turned my head that way. Nick? I asked again. When I looked forward again, all of my reflections were facing away from me, all except the one in front. She was facing me with a horrible grin plastered onto her face. She beckoned for me. As if in a trance, I could only shake my head. When I didn't move forward, her grin turned into a snarl and she began slamming her fists against the glass. I let out a blood-curdling scream as I saw my vision go spotty. I stepped back in such a panic that I smashed into the mirror behind me. I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head as a shower of glass rained down around me. I'm certain I passed out for a moment, both from pain and fear. When I came to, I could feel something warm and sticky dripping down my back. I reached up my hand and it came away bloody. No, I moaned. I could faintly hear Nick yelling for me. I dragged myself up into a sitting position, wincing as my hands and legs got further cut up from the glass. Across the room, I could see Nick, and hundreds of Nick's reflections, kneeling down in front of me. I closed and rubbed my eyes, shaking my head in the process. How could Nick be with my reflection when he wasn't here with me? I must have hit my head harder than I thought to myself. I could hear him talking, but it sounded muted and far away. I heard the word help, but not much more. He stood up and sprinted for the door. I couldn't tell if he was coming back or not, and as it seemed like I could get up and walk, I decided to try. I was still anxious to get out of this hall of horrors. I finally made it to the exit door. It had become extremely foggy and unseasonably cold while we were inside. The air had a terrible metallic tang to it that filled my nose and mouth. I shivered in the wind that whipped brutally around me. As I glanced around, I realized that I didn't see anyone else nearby. No people, no cars, nothing. Grimacing, I whipped out my phone to call for an ambulance myself, but the battery was dead. Come on. I yelled in frustration. I slowly started hobbling towards the road. I figured I could at least catch a cab. But there was no one on the road either. I began to cry again. What a nightmare this night turned out to be. I staggered home, alone and freezing. When I got back inside, I plugged my phone in. I needed to let someone know that I was hurt and where I ended up. When the phone powered on, a barrage of texts came in, mostly from Nick. But they were all jumbled up. A random mix of letters, numbers, and symbols. I couldn't make heads or tails of any of it. I tried to send a text back, but it refused to send. I couldn't even get a signal to make a call. Panic, bitter like bile, threatened to rise up again, but I fought it off. I would deal with the shoddy cell service later. For now, I needed to take care of myself. Once I started to clean myself up, I quickly realized that most of my cuts were shallow or superficial. I was able to get the glass out and get everything cleaned up on my own. Well, every piece except one. I could feel one near the top of my head that I just couldn't get a good grip on. I closed my eyes and let out a deep breath. I was going to need to use the mirror. I hobbled into the guest room and slowly pulled away the sheet. Before, there had been nothing more frightening than seeing my reflection in the mirror. But that night, I realized there was one thing more terrifying than seeing my reflection in the mirror. Not seeing it at all.